once said, when you speak to a man in a language that he understands, you speak to his head. But when you speak to a man in his own language, you speak to his heart. Hello and welcome. This is Dorcas Glader, the host of Dorcas Diaries. And today I wanted to talk to you about languages. Last week I was talking about how I came to speak about how I came to speak Spanish as my third language. One of the things that I've always felt embarrassed about is the fact that while I speak three international languages quite fairly, I do not have the fluency um, of any African languages I don't have up to 50% of fluency in any of the African languages that I speak or I used to speak. And that is the topic I want to dive about without being very academic about it. Um, One of the benefits or two of learning another language is, for me, number one, you get a deeper meaning or understanding of your own language. So when you speak one language, you have different ideas of what certain words mean to you or certain expressions. But I find that when you speak another language, you have some other language to compare how people translate, interpret emotions, how people translate words, how people view things. You have a deeper meaning. For example, when we say hospitality, and you go to the French word hospitalité, when you look at the two words in the dictionary, you have a more profound respect and idea of all that it can entail or what it can encompass, as opposed to if you just knew the English word without knowing the etymology of the word. Okay, that's what I'm trying to say. For example, you would say, in English language, we usually say, make me understand, whereas in Spanish, we would say, give me to understand, so that you now understand that for a Spanish person, when we are asking for explanation, we are asking you to give us information that makes a situation clearer. Whereas with English language, when we say make me to understand, we are not asking you to give us information, but rather to convert our current state from that of confusion to a point of clarity, right? So one thing I found out with most of us who are from Africa, like I said, we are bilingual or multilingual, is that for those of us who grew up in the city, we usually are shy to speak our local languages, you know. And I think just like generational trauma, this is also a generational heritage from our parents, because languages can be arms or tools in the hands of your enemies or your perceived rivals, whether at work or in a community where you live, in a certain setting, at school, So let's go back to pre-colonial, post-colonial times or pre-colonial times, where we all spoke certain languages, and people who worked as translators were quite tricky to deal with, because the way they took their jobs could either make or mar the relationship between two kingdoms or two villages or two cities. So they were at a higher advantage, even than at more advantage, higher advantage than the rulers of the time, because if I needed to transmit a message to a certain ruler and I didn't speak his language, the person who spoke both languages had an advantage, because he could foment trouble between the two of us, or he could proffer peace. I think you see that in history books, where someone sends an emissary and this person with wisdom goes to the other person and, calms the situation using milder words, using kinder words, or goes there and says something quite different and thereby bringing peace. So a language, even though it's part of our culture, can actually be a tool. Now, I began to think about why most of us in the cities were not encouraged by our parents to speak our local dialect, and this is what I came up with. This is the answer I came up with, that when you hello Guadalupe, how are you? When you went to school, the language, the lingua franca, determined what determined how much you spoke to people. So I'll give you an example. In Africa, most of us whose parents grew up in the countryside or in the villages, when they came to the city, they sent us to school, right? So we would speak our native languages at home, and then we would speak English or French, depending on your country. Now, when you have parents who grew up like that, they didn't speak English with their children, right? But when you have parents who rather grew up in the city, or who worked in academic settings. So when I mean academic settings, like they are teachers, they are professors, people who are salary earners, white collar job people, they wanted that standard in their families to say English, Queen's English is the standard, or French is the standard, so you don't speak local languages because you're going to school. The least you can do is to speak proper English. And I was thinking about it, like I said, if you look at it during colonial times, those people who were able to speak the white man's language, so to say, had the advantage of, being closer to our colonial masters. They were able to get better jobs, they were able to be in proximity with the colonial master or the slave master, as you want to call it, and that gave them an advantage over their fellow Africans who did not speak the white man's language, right? So that you find out that people began to want to learn English, and to a certain degree, actually, there was that custom where people, after independence, when most African countries got independence, they went abroad to learn more about the white man's language, improve their knowledge of the white man's language and technology and all that, to get Western education, basically. So we now have a generation like my generation and the younger one after us, the late millennials and the early Gen Zs, being raised in a place where we are now ashamed to speak our own native language because it is not far reaching, because it is not the language of instruction at school, because it is archaic, it is a symbol of, how would I even put it now, is a symbol of not being elegant, whereas the better you spoke an international language like French or English or Portuguese, in the case of our Zimbabwe, Mozambican and Angolan brothers, you were considered elegant, you were considered brilliant, you were considered at a higher advantage in society. This was not what I found out when I got to South Africa. Okay, South Africa has got 12, 12 official languages. In fact, some of these languages are used as the means of instruction in schools, so that a child speaks Xhosa at home, goes to school, learns in Xhosa, and yet ends up with an education. We in other African countries didn't have that advantage, And when I lived there, I didn't really appreciate it because it kind of puts the rest of we Africans on, on the spotlight. Like you would be on a bus, you wouldn't be able to speak with them because everybody was speaking their language. And the one thing that I found most interesting for me was the fact that they could speak their respective language to one another and have a fluent conversation without the other person having to speak in the other person's language. What do I mean? So you see a Sotho person speaking to a Xhosa person, and they would be speaking. This person will be speaking Sotho. This person will be speaking Xhosa, and they would be having a very nice conversation, understanding one another. No qualms. In other African countries, however, you had to either learn the dominant language of a region, which is, I would say, a regional language. For example, in Nigeria, in the north, everybody is expected to speak Hausa, and in the east, everybody is expected to speak Igbo, whereas southwest, everybody should know Yoruba or Yoruba. Yeah, I'm African, let me pronounce it right. Yoruba. you know. So, but a Yoruba man would not have a conversation with an Edo man in their respective languages. They would have to use that Yoruba language. But in South Africa, that is not the case. That is not the case. They maintain this. And if you see, when I checked it closely, those languages are quite related. For example, Xhosa and Zulu are close. The Swana and Sesotho also come from the same family, so they can understand one another. But what I'm saying is that language, as a part of our culture, is something that is very dear and very, very precious to South Africans. And I say that because it is a key identifier for them. So there's a way you would speak Zulu in Johannesburg, and they would know if you were from KwaZulu Natal or if you were a Josie or a Gauteng person. Josie is Johannesburg, for those of you who don't know. Or if you came to the Free State, there would be a way you would speak Sesotho, and we would know if you were from the Lesotho Kingdom or you were from the Free State, or if you were speaking Setswana. And those are cultural markers which we should not be ashamed of. When I came to Ecuador, I noticed something similar where the vast majority, I would dare say 90% of Ecuadorians only speak Spanish because most of their native languages are lost. You only find people speaking native languages like the Shuar, like the other tribes, like I always remember Shuar, the Achua or something like that, and the Sachilas, they still uphold that native languages. So that Spanish is a lingua franca for these natives, which they use at the marketplace. Their children learn that to get an education, but in the cultural home, in the ancestral place, in the family, there is a language that identifies them as natives. And that is a very beautiful thing. Sadly to say, as someone who is aspiring to become a linguist, a lot of native languages are getting lost. And it's also saddening to me now that I have traveled across the continent or across the seas to see that we are actually ashamed of speaking our own languages. In fact, for many younger people today, they are not even proud of bearing their native names. So you find people trying to Englishise their names, as if our native tongue was something to be ashamed of, as if it was barbaric. People don't want to bear native names, which you wouldn't see in South Africa. It was in South Africa I got to know that I think the white men played a big number on us when we were given what we call baptismal name and native name. In South Africa, they were forced, I think, almost to learn how to pronounce those names. You'll see someone who will be a Musimani Kumalo, and he has no English name. That is just his name. Whereas in Western Africa, you will hear somebody who will be Ogochi John Chinwendu, because he has to have the baptismal name John, which is an English name, to say he was either educated or up to par with Western civilization. It doesn't make sense. And I think that is one that is one reason why the South African languages will not die out as fast as other African languages are dying out, because they they have schools where their children get an education in their own African languages and they speak that language. If you listen to SA radio or TV, even in the House of Parliament, they have made those languages official. So they are not just regional languages, but they are official languages where the people are now forced, not even forced, they are just they adapt to listening to those languages so that they can follow the news, so that they can get an education. So if you're from a different tribe and you went to another part of the country, you would have to learn that language. And it's a beautiful thing because it is our identity. The purpose of why I'm making this video is to say we should appreciate our own native languages as Africans. If you're an African, like myself, especially in the diaspora, you know what it is not to be able to speak your own language when you hear other people speaking a different language and then you have to learn that language. So, for example, you go to Germany and you have to learn German. You know the joy it is when you hear someone from your homeland speaking your own language. Even if they're not speaking your language, like from your indigenous language, but just when they speak English with that national accent. For example, one Nigeria to another Nigerian, and you go and you hear someone say, "Wait till you talk," that alone, it's already, you feel it gives you a sense of safety. It gives you a sense of safety. So while our parents thought that making us learn international languages or white men's languages would open the world up to us, it's not really the case today with technology and things. We're losing our own identity, by not speaking our languages. We are losing a huge part of us, our heritage, by not teaching our children our own African languages. Let me know, how many languages do you speak? Hey Basi in Sana, how are you? Um, that's the essence of what I'm trying to say. That just the way the English people um, came up with uh, what we know as English language today from the nomadic languages of the people who conquered them, I think we should also keep our language, if for nothing, just for a better understanding of some other aspects of our cultures, of our ancestral roots, our origins, because there are words, there are expressions that we cannot really, translate into English language. So I learned that from South Africa, that their languages are likely not to die. Their languages are likely not to die as fast as other languages are dying out, because it's a very inherent and functional part of their culture. Okay? So if you're an African, ask yourself, how many African languages do I learn? How many African languages do I know? And is it relevant? Going back home to the countryside, does it really, speaking English, has it really helped you to foster a bond with your elders, with your family, your folks who are back home? Okay? And I'll see you guys next Saturday. Probably we'll have to take this all over again. All right. Bye bye.